Alex from South Carolina asks, what is one thing I can do to make my academic papers easier to read? Well, Alex, this video is for you. So I like Alex's question because there's not one thing that you can do as a student to make your paper easier to read. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do to make your papers easier to read. But the number one thing I recommend and I actually recommend it, well, I don't recommend it, I require it in all my classes, is the use of subheadings and headings in any kind of academic paper. It makes it extremely easy to follow. It breaks up sections. It makes it a lot easier for the professors to grade, and I'll show you why right now. Okay, so what we're going to use is we're going to use our makeshift student paper that we were working on earlier. Remember, we did the title page, we did the running head, and then the reference page here on the bottom. Now, let me move my head out of the way so you can actually see it. We're going to start right here on page 1. This is a simple one page, let me see here, 1.5 page report. A typical academic report is 2 to 4 pages max for an undergrad course, right? So how do we apply subheadings? Well, you have to understand what the difference is between a heading and a subheading. Now, a heading is level 1, right? It's the top. So in an academic style paper, your heading is always going to be your title. So the title of your paper is technically your heading. Everything under that is a subsection heading. Now, APA and MLA both in their guides and their style guides recommend the use of subheadings and headings to make it easier to read. And they both follow pretty much the same recommendations and the same patterns. Now, Chicago, for some reason, they don't require it in their style guide, but they highly recommend it. And that's the reason why you see subheadings and headings in professional documents in newspapers and magazines, is because it does make it a lot easier to read. Now, level 1 subheading is technically your section heading, right? So that's your top level. And from there's 4 different levels of subheadings. So level 2 is called a subsection heading, and that's where we're going to focus most of our time in most of the academic papers. Now, the larger papers, your thesis, capstone, projects, they might even have all 5 levels of subsection headings. But for most, stick with level 2. And let me go into a little bit of detail on the different levels so you can understand what I'm talking about. So level 1, you have a section heading. That's your title, right? Level 2, you have a subsection heading. That's where we're going to spend most of our time, is with the subsection heading. Level 3 is a subsection of a subsection heading, right? And level 4 is a subsection under a subsection of a subsection heading, and level 5 is a subsection under the 3 subsections headings. That's kind of hard to say. Each level you go, it requires something a little bit different as far as font, italics, and punctuation or capitalization, right? But for this paper, we're just going to be focusing on the level 1, which is your section heading or your title, and level 2 is a subsection heading. Okay, so we have our document here. Let me scroll it up. And I already explained the different types of subsection headings. Remember, we're only focusing really on level 2, the level 2 subheading. That's the most common in these types of papers. The ones that you're going to be writing every week, right, is level 2. So how does it work? All right, the very first thing that I do, let me pull it over here, is I get the directions of the assignment. Now, the directions of this assignment are pretty simple. There's a couple different points. So it says research the pros and cons of tenancy and common agreements, and then explain the differences between tenancy and common and joint tenancy. That's the directions. That's it. Very, very simple. But you got to kind of read into it. It says research the pros and cons of tenancy and in common agreement. Now, you could have one subsection heading, or you can have 2 subsection headings, right? One for the pros and one for the cons of tendency and common, and then explain the differences between tendency and common and joint tendency. So you could have another one or two depending on what you want to do. Now, this is what I recommend. Your intro will never have a subsection heading. So you're not going to put right here, let me move up, you're never going to put introduction. It's a given. Your first paragraph or two is going to be your intro all the way up until your first subsection heading. So you have, for the sake of this paper, just because I like a good solid intro, I'm going to have these two paragraphs represent our intro. Now our third paragraph, let's do it pros of tendency and common. Do you know what? Let's change it to pros and cons. So pros and cons of tendency and common. That's our subsection. You see something a little bit different here. It's in title capitalization, right? So you're gonna capitalize it just like you would your normal title. You're also going to bold it just like that. Now APA will want an extra space here, and I kind of recommend it. It makes it a little bit cleaner. So go ahead and add an extra space right here between your intro paragraph and your first title heading. I do not recommend doing this, adding an extra space after your subheading, just because look at how nasty it looks, right? It looks gross. So go ahead and clean it up a little bit. Keep one space before the subheading, if that makes sense. All right, so pros and cons of tendency and common. I did that because pros and cons typically will go together in a subsection or in a section, right? So this paragraph will represent the pros, this one will represent the cons. Okay, so what's our next one? Our next one is explain the differences between tendency and common. So then I'll do the same thing, right? I'll put differences. Whoa, see that happens when you're not paying attention. Differences. So sometimes if you're not paying attention and you know what it is. Differences between tendency and common and joint tendency. Okay, very simple heading, right? And you bold it. You don't, if it's right here on a new page, you don't have to add that extra space, right? Only if it's in combination with like this. So if it's in combination with other subsections, then you have to. If it's the start of another page, you don't have to. Okay, so you have the differences between the tendency and common and joint tendency. So let's look at our directions, make sure we hit all those points. Research the pros and cons of tendency and common. That's one. Explain the differences between tendency and common and joint tendency. And that's another one. So the last section is going to be the conclusion, and conclusions typically, right, come at the end of your document. I've seen conclusions actually in the middle, and I've seen their conclusion up at the top for the intro. So yes, put your conclusion at the bottom of your document because it's a conclusion. Now, right now it's kind of combined with this subsection, and you don't want that, right? You want to keep it as an actual conclusion. So there's two different ways of doing it. The first way is just by adding an extra space and leaving it like this. Now, this is what I like, because if you add this extra space, it's a given that that's a natural, it's called a natural break in the document. So it's separating the top subsection, so the differences between tendency and common, so this subsection from the rest of your document, right? So it's kind of by itself. Or you can do the second thing, which is add the word conclusion. And just like this. Either way works fine, and it's completely up to you. Well, actually, it's up to the professor on what he wants. So play around with what works for you. If the professor says do it another way, just do it the other way. So there we have it. That is how you use subsections in academic papers. Now it's very simple. The very easiest thing that you can do is take the directions for the assignment, break them up, and use the directions as the individual subsections. Your teachers are also going to be really happy if you do it that way, because it makes grading a lot easier for them. And if it makes grading easier for them, trust me, they'll pass that love on to you with typically a higher grade, right? So you want to make your document as easy to read as possible for not only your reader, but for yourself, so you make sure you hit each point in the directions. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. Have a great day.